This is what you would see if it wasn't for the hard-working volunteers at Channel 10. But thanks to their great effort, this is what you get.
Welcome to the Kootenay Quilters biannual show. We have been quilters in Nelson for the last 10 years. We do a show every 2 years, and the work just keeps getting better and better. We show the best of quilting in our area, and luckily this year some from outside our area. This quilt that we're going to show you is the Nelson Heritage Quilt. It was made by our group to donate to the Nelson Museum. It depicts buildings in Nelson, most of which are still standing. Some have burned down. Most people in Nelson can recognize the buildings. There's the old courthouse, the Evangelical Church, the Anglican Church, the old Opera House, Blaylock Estates, and of course down in the corner, our tram. It will hang in the Nelson Museum. They're really pleased that we're giving it to them. Each year, the Nelson Group makes 2 quilts to raffle for the Hospital Equipment Fund. This is our 1991 raffle quilt, and it will be drawn on Saturday, the 21st or the 20th of October. It's applique, and our theme this year is applique. You will see many applique quilts in the show. This quilt was made by Rose Johnson. It's an applique quilt. It exhibits the best in applique work, fine quilting, perfect circles, perfect points. It's actually going to be used for Christmas. This quilt was made by Mio Mori. It's a first quilt, and as she said, she started out making quite a small quilt, but it just kept growing. It measures 110 inches by 120 inches. This wall hanging was made by Shirley Hubble of Winlaw, BC. The applique is very realistic. This is another applique quilt made by the Knight Group of the Kootenay Quilters. It's the same patterns that you have seen in other quilts, except this time we went on a monochromatic color scheme and used hand-dyed fabric. It will be raffled in the spring of 1992. Quilting isn't only for bed covering. You can use it in clothing, as is used here, made by Chris Halloran. Christmas is coming, and what would be better for Christmas than a quilt? The Kootenay Quilters work on Christmas items all year round. This year, our charitable project is Christmas stockings, and we have made Christmas stockings. The Beta Sigma Phi in Nelson will be filling them, and we'll be giving them to the Salvation Army. I have to. If I don't get there. She said, beautiful Christmas scenes, and Santa Claus at his best. Each year, the Canadian Quilting Association has a raffle quilt. The Canadian Quilting Association represents Canadian quilters from coast to coast and in all the territories. Last year, or this current year in 1991, the regional representatives made the blocks of their provinces, and the Kootenay Quilters took on the job of quilting the quilt. The quilt was won by Marlene McLean in Vancouver. It was actually raffled at our national conference in Ottawa. They did an exquisite job of quilting it. In the 1800s, it was common for a young woman to have to make 12 quilts before she was married. And the 13th quilt was made by her friends and was a presentation quilt, a marriage quilt. This is a typical marriage quilt, and it's called the Country Bride, and we have made 2 of them. We will raffle one next year for our 1992 raffle. But I think there would be a lot of single women if they had to make 12 quilts before they could marry now. This is a very good depiction of a 1930 pattern. It's called Little Dutch Girl. It's a variation on a Dresden plate, and you may see this in several quilts. It was made by Winnie Michaud of our day group. The quilting is very fine. This quilt is called Dancing Tulips, and it's superimposed on a hole in the barn door block, so it's actually called barn door tulips. It's made of hand-dyed fabric, and hand-dyed fabric is becoming more and more common now because quilters can't find the color they want. They go out and create it themselves. This quilt was exhibited in Ottawa at the National Conference and has also been in several other shows, and I made it. This is a sampler quilt done by Louise O'Neill. A sampler is actually a way of collecting patterns. Every pattern is different, and before photographs, women were able to save patterns by putting them into sampler quilts. This is also a good teaching tool if you're a brand new quilter because you learn how to do all sorts of things. This is a quilt, The 12 Days of Christmas by Rose Johnson. It would be nice at the holidays, but it would also be nice to hang any other time. This is a quilter's challenge. In this case, our quilters were each given the same pattern and depicted the pattern in their own fabric. These were done for Art Walk in 1990. It's hard to believe they're all exactly the same pattern. While applique is applying fabric on top, piecing is actually cutting apart large pieces of fabric and sewing them back together again. And these are 2 outstanding examples of log cabin quilts. Log cabin quilts were actually developed in colonial times, and the red center is supposed to signify the home fires. And so in this case, it's an offset log cabin. We have a large red square in the middle, and the logs of fabric build up around the home fire. This is a log cabin sampler. As you can see, much like the other quilt we looked at, there are individual patterns set inside log cabin blocks. This is a charm quilt. In Victorian times, women would collect fabric, and it was a real challenge to have every piece of fabric in your quilt top different. We still have that kind of challenge now among quilters, and this has one pattern piece, and every piece of fabric in the top is a different fabric. Okay. Quilts don't have to go on beds, they can also go on walls. And what we have here are wall hangings in various methods. The two black ones here are Amish style, and underneath are the Amish dolls made by Norma Vecchio. The Amish are actually Pennsylvania Dutch related people living in the eastern United States and renowned worldwide for their quilting. The quilt over here with hands is made by Amy Baudet. She is our youngest quilter. She's 10 years old, and it's hand quilted and depicts all the hands of all her friends. The wall hangings above are a calla lily pattern developed for a class. The one is on the left is hand-dyed fabric. The other one is traditional applique. They're made by myself. Again, applique figures strongly in wall hangings because it is a much more skillful process than piecing often. Norma Vecchio did the bird cage, and again the divers above. Part of their cultural exchange program, Australia has arranged a tour of traveling quilts. We are very lucky to have this tour at our show this year. It is one of the few places in Canada where it's being exhibited. It has traveled throughout China, has been throughout Canada, and immediately after the show we'll be going to Washington, D.C., and from there to Ireland. The quilts depict Australian quilting at its best. It's very different from Canadian quilting. Free Spirit by Cynthia Morgan is actually pleated, and the colors are revealed when the pleats are turned back upon themselves. Aussie Bush 5 is by Fiona Gavins. It is machine pieced and beautifully done. The workmanship is fantastic. It depicts the bush area of the southeast coastal part of Australia. Murky Dam by Jan Irvin. It's actually airbrushed with fabric dyes and then quilted. It is one solid piece of fabric and is exquisite from an artistic viewpoint. Things aren't always dull in Australia, as depicted by Carnival, a quilt by Barbara Macy. Very bright and very, very good workmanship. Evening Forest by Wendy Lugg represents the forests in the western part of Australia. It is done with stenciling, cyanotyping, hand-dyed fabric, and printing on top of fabric. This is Kangaroo Killing. It's by Susan Blanchfield. And from a bias point of view, it's my very favorite piece in the whole show. It's an Aboriginal piece. It has kangaroo hair woven into it and has actual animal claws tied in on the top. It depicts the dry desert areas of Australia. Sunburst Country by Trudy Billingsley, a wonderful depiction of the very dry northern mining area of Australia. Applique, with actual pieces of what we would call fancy fabric sewn into it. And if you notice in the lower left-hand corner, even a small Australian quilt. Flag. Threads of Journey by Pamela Gaunt is actually the signature quilt for the entire display. It has threads woven into it from all over Australia. And although it might not be a quilt in the classification of something to put on a bed, it is 3 layers of fabric and is beautifully done. Where is the name tag? This is Light Play by Elshia King, and it refers to the natural vegetation of Australia. It is actually a felted piece, quilted. She calls it a symbolic mediator between heaven and earth. Altered Priorities by Wendy Holland. Actually started out as a very traditional quilt, but as the time went on, she put more of herself into it. And that's why it has very, very traditional fabrics, some native Australian fabrics, and then spreads out, as she said, her stress grew larger. This is Square Dance by Karen Eden. It is an applique piece. The organdy and silk pieces are loose on top and the lame is woven through. It gives it a life all its own. World it's going, we have a list of places it's going. This is called Shot to Pieces by Ruth Stoneley. It depicts our lifestyles. No matter how calm it may be and how neat and orderly, every once in a while it all gets shot to pieces. By definition, this quilt might not be what you would usually see. It is 2 layers of silk organdy, and in the middle are all threads off her sewing room floor. But they're bound together in a way that depicts the actual casual way that most of us attempt our lives. The buttons hold it together. It's very, very delicate. This exhibit will be traveling after it leaves here on Monday. It will be going to the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, and from there to Ireland, and from there through Europe. It won't actually be back in Australia until early 1994. Magic Carpet by Jane Long. What might seem traditional at first is not, as she has fractured her design to give the effect of opals from the north of Australia. Rendering Devils Harmless by Rosemarie Schultz. It says, is this what I've been through, or is this what I want? And it has the devils dancing all over it. It is machine quilted. A very interesting art piece. Refuge by Krista Roskandik is a very, very well done depiction of a scene done in piecing. And as you can, by her play of light and her use of color, you can actually see the refuge in the middle, away from the hot and fiery edges. Summer Garden by Judy Turner is actually strip pieced behind. All the strips were sewn on, and then the lattice work and the flowers were sewn on top. It's a very good play on color, and the excitement of the yellow flowers bounding out of the lattice gives us more visual impact. It's using Liberty of London prints. A Glimpse of the Tree of Life by Julie Mongrut. It is actually cut work done on cotton. It uses the fabric dyes to give us the color. It is not a quilt in the sense that you would put it on a bed, but it is 3 layers, a back, a middle, and the absolutely beautiful cutwork on top, and would fit into our well-broadened definition of a quilt. Sea and Sky Mosaic by Diane Firth is actually very traditional, and yet if you look at it, it actually looks as if the sea were spreading into the sky and a reflection. It is impeccably pieced, and her use of color is just wonderful. Gompen by Sylvana Gardner depicts the Aboriginal people of Australia. It is very well done. It is done in reverse applique, similar to the mola styles of South Africa and Southeast Asia. In Australia, as there are in Canada, there are many men quilters, and here we have 2 very good examples. Greg Somerville has done Floating in the Sea. It is a fabric printed technique with reverse applique. It's also machine appliqued. Kolacha by John Corbett is an abstract design, but notice the colors, what impact they have. It has a typical masculine view of things. Phoenix 2 by Judy Holworth actually is very, very typical of a lot of things going on in the United States now, and it's typical of work by a quilt artist called Nancy Crow, but it's very Australian in that she has used exclusively fabrics that were available and locally made in Australia. It is a beautiful piece. Each year, our quilting group goes on a retreat, and while to some of you a retreat might seem a religious experience, for our retreats we take sewing machines and usually import a teacher. Our last retreat was held in Lemon Creek Lodge in September of 1990, and we made the hanging for their lodge. It depicts the Canada goose, which fly over Lemon Creek Lodge, the log cabin, which we had a class on, and also the swirling maple leaves. This is a whole cloth quilt. A whole cloth quilt is actually just 2 layers of fabric, no piecing, no applique, and the quilting gives you the design and the wonderful dimension. This is a work by Angelique Krauss-Worth of Selmo. She is a quilt artist who's exhibited nationally, and we're very lucky to have some of her quilts in our show. It is called Early Thursday Morning. It contains piecing, appliquing, hand stitching, embroidery, and she's used silk and mixed fabrics, and it gives you an excitement of what you might see in Nelson on Early Thursday morning. In the late 1800s, it was very common to have what they called Victorian crazy quilts. They didn't exactly have a pattern. They just had very special pieces of fabric, and they embroidered them down and added beading and added appliquing, and they were very, very exciting. This is an authentic turn-of-the-century crazy quilt. It's very worn, and as many of them are, because of the dyes used at that time, the fabric deteriorates rather quickly, and the metallic salts in them. Quilts have just been realized as art pieces in the last 10 or 15 years, and it's a shame when you find something like this that has been stored in a plastic bag and not given the real honor it deserves. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece. It's too delicate to hang. For those of you who are raised in British Columbia, you will recognize the name of Rogers for Rogers Golden Syrup or Rogers Sugar. This quilt is actually made of pieces of Mr. Rogers' ties. Why, we don't know, but it was bought at a garage sale for $2. Ties are from the mid-30s and 40s, and it's starting to wear where the silk and rayon have been. But it's something that should be treasured, and to have bought it for $2 is almost unbelievable. Thank you for coming to our quilt show. We hope we've given you a glimpse into the world of quilting, and especially the world of Nelson quilting. Our next quilt show will be in October of 1993, and if you need any information about quilting, we're always at the mall, quilting our little fingers away.
I